Now it's time to look at pedigree analysis, and this is a technique that geneticists use to try to identify inheritance patterns of diseases. And one of the main questions we can ask is a disease presenting a dominant or recessive inheritance pattern? Does that tell us something about the genes that are involved? And also we can ask about the location in the genome of the genes that are responsible for a disease. Are they on autosomes? Are they on sex chromosomes? Or are they in the cytoplasm, which is typically the mitochondrial DNA? To do pedigree analysis, we have a few symbols that we use. We've got squares and circles, and those can either be filled in or half filled in or empty. Squares indicate males. Circles indicate females. So I've drawn 2 males up here and 2 females. And when individuals are not affected by a trait, that is, when they don't show a disease phenotype, they're not filled in. So for now, we'll call those wild type individuals. When a symbol is completely filled in, that indicates the presence of a disease phenotype. That is, they're showing the phenotype of whatever medical issue we're dealing with. A half filled in circle or square is the symbol for a carrier. This is just notation that geneticists add. This doesn't indicate that the person shows half of the symptoms of a disease. This individual that's a carrier does not have any of the symptoms of the disease, but we know that they're heterozygous for a recessive mutation that causes the disease. So they have the predisposition to be able to pass on the potential to get this disease to their offspring, but this individual herself does not demonstrate the presence of that phenotype. So here's a pedigree, and we're going to look at first an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. And in this case, we have 2 sets of parents that have each had 4 children, and 2 of those children have married, or not, I suppose, and had 8 children. And you'll notice that each of these generations has an equal number of males and females in it, and I've only done that to make these patterns that are different between different inheritance patterns pretty evident. So if this individual has an autosomal dominant disorder, we don't yet know if this individual is heterozygous or homozygous for that trait. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you the inheritance patterns, and I'm going to give you each printouts of this pedigree with these patterns filled in. And what I'd like you to do after we're done with the movie is to draw out the chromosomes and the mutations and see if these inheritance patterns make sense, and try to figure out, for example, is this individual heterozygous for a dominant mutation that causes this disease, or is this individual homozygous? So the autosomal dominant pattern is, in general, half of the offspring. Now I'm going to give you the answer. If this individual is heterozygous, half of their offspring will be affected, including one of these individuals now I've shown that's married to this other male, or having children with this other male anyway. So that individual then will pass this trait on to, usually, half of their offspring. And you'll notice that I've filled in half males and half females. And that's because this is an autosomal trait. It doesn't display any bias towards being inherited by one sex. So a couple of patterns. Males and females are equally affected in each generation in this inheritance pattern. And in this case, roughly half of the individuals are getting the dominant mutation. Now we're going to see how this compares to an autosomal recessive mutation. Now we're going to look at an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. And in this case, I'm showing that 2 individuals in 2 separate families, this woman and this man, both exhibit this recessive trait. When we're talking about a recessive trait, we know then that both of these individuals have mutations on both of the chromosomes, and this is an autosomal recessive example I'm showing you. So 2 autosomes, both copies of the autosomes have mutations, the asterisks. But only one of those genes, one of those alleles, is going to be contributed to each individual in the next generation. So we already know, for example, that every offspring from this individual is going to be a carrier. Now, these individuals don't show the phenotype, so you won't normally see this information when I give you a pedigree. This is information that you infer once you figure out that this is a recessive pattern. And we'll know again, in this case, that all of these individuals are going to be carriers. What this means is one of the typifying patterns of recessive inheritance patterns is that the disease skips a generation, because you only get one copy of the recessive allele in every one of these individuals. So none of them show the disease. We have disease in this generation, not in this generation. But now we're going to see, because two carriers are having children, occasionally, what percentage of the time, occasionally, those two asterisk alleles, the mutant alleles, are going to be combined into the same offspring. So hopefully by now you've calculated that likelihood. It's 1/2 chance of getting the bad allele from the mom multiplied by 50%, or 1/2 chance of getting that bad allele or gene from the dad. So 25% of these offspring are going to show that recessive trait. So it's present in this generation, it skips a generation, and it shows up again in a later generation. Now, some number of these individuals are going to be carriers, and we're not going to go into guessing which is which at this point. So again, the typifying pattern for autosomal recessive inheritance is not just that it skips a generation, but that males and females are still equally affected. That suggests that this is not a sex-linked X chromosome or Y chromosome-based inheritance pattern. Now we're going to move on to X-linked traits, and in this example we'll talk about an X-linked dominant inheritance pattern. Now, in this case I'm showing, again, a male that's affected by an X-linked dominant trait and a female. So for a female, because she has two X chromosomes, we don't know if she's heterozygous or homozygous for the dominant trait. But because males are hemizygous, only have one copy of the X chromosome, we know that this male's X chromosome is affected once we figure out that this is an X-linked dominant trait. So here's a pattern that's typical of those traits. Males pass their Y chromosomes by definition to all of their sons. It has to be the case. They're males, they're squares on the pedigree because they got the Y chromosome from their dad that makes them male. That means that all of the male's daughters inherit his X chromosome. They get one X chromosome from mom, they get their X chromosome from their dad. If they get the mutant X chromosome from the dad, they're affected with the disease. If, again, this is a dominant X-linked pattern. Now, what's happening over here? Well, let's say that mom has a couple of kids that show this trait, but not all of them. Again, this tells us that the mom was heterozygous. She's got one normal copy of her X chromosome and one that's mutant. So half of her kids get her normal X chromosome, and the other half of the kids get the mutant version. And anytime you inherit the mutant version, you show the disease because this is dominant. From the mom's side, we'll call that cross 1, even though we don't normally talk about crossing humans together. We see that there's no difference in sex ratio of who gets the trait, so both males and females can be equally affected. Here's a critical point about sex-linked traits. When we do a second cross, or reciprocal cross, in this case the mother was affected, the father was wild type. When we switch those and have an affected father and an unaffected mother, sex-linked traits show different patterns of inheritance when you look at this cross versus this cross. So here, no difference in sexes, but here we see that only females inherit the trait from their dad. So then we can look at how this female passes that trait on to the next generation. So female will only have received, if this is dominant, the mom's wild type, so we know she does not have any mutant X chromosomes. The only mutant X chromosome is here in one copy in the father. So we can infer that that female is heterozygous. Got a wild type version of the X from the mom. So she will pass half of her offspring on average the mutant version. So males can get that trait just as likely as females can because they're inheriting it from the mother. So this is a pattern that's typical of an X-linked dominant trait. It's a trait that shows up in every generation, and in two different cross patterns, in reciprocal crosses, you see different patterns of inheritance. If it's inherited from mom, it affects males and females equally. If it's inherited from dad, it only affects his daughters. And here we're going to look at an X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. This gene that's mutant that causes this disease in a female and in a male is located on the X chromosome. So if a female is showing this disease, we know that she has 2 mutant copies of the X chromosome once we figure out that this is a recessive X-linked pedigree. So she will pass that 1 mutant copy to all of her kids. So the daughters will be carriers. What happens to the males? Now, this is the interesting part, and this is how you diagnose X-linked recessive disorders. Remember, males only get 1 X chromosome. They get their Y chromosome from their dad, so they get their X chromosome from their mom. So as you'd predict, every individual, when mom is homozygous for a mutation, every individual is going to get 1 mutant copy of that chromosome, for sure. Here's the difference. Males don't have a Y chromosome. They only have 1 copy of whatever gene this is mutated. It's the one that's on their X chromosome. Because males are hemizygous for the X chromosome, males aren't carriers. Males exhibit the disease because their only copy of the X chromosome has the mutation. Even though it's recessive, the reason that these mutations are often recessive is because when you're heterozygous, when you're plus over asterisk, that 1 copy, the good copy, the plus, gives enough gene and enough protein produced from that gene, usually, to let you not have the disease. But in the case of males, where they're XY, their only copy of the X chromosome has a mutation. They don't have a wild type copy of that gene on their Y chromosome, usually. So in this case, they're recessive because, or they're affected because, even though this is a recessive trait, you only have to get 1 mutant copy if you're a male. So affected, carrier, affected, carrier. Now on this side, we've got an affected male, which means that he has a mutant X chromosome. Will his sons also be affected? No, because they get their Y chromosome from their father. So the father will pass his guaranteed mutant X chromosome to all of his daughters. But they get a wild type version, we will expect, but we don't know yet, from their mother. So all of his daughters will at least be carriers. And if we see no phenotype in this generation, then you can guess mom's genotype. I'll let you think about that. Now, the males won't have this disease. So what's going to happen in the next generation? This individual is the only individual that can pass this trait on to the next generation. So mom has 2 X chromosomes, 1's wild type, 1's mutant. So half of her daughters will get the wild type X and half will get the mutant version. So she'll have some daughters that are not carriers and some that are. What about the males? The males have a 50-50 chance, just like the females did. The males in this generation have a 50-50 chance of inheriting either the good X chromosome or the mutant X chromosome. So half of the males will be not carriers, right, as we saw up here, but affected by this trait. And the other half will be wild type. They get a normal X chromosome, the wild type version from their mother. So like an autosomal recessive trait, this one skips a generation. This doesn't skip a generation in one cross direction. When the mom is affected, males are affected. We have carrier daughters. So this is weird in that it's a recessive disease that in one cross direction, when mom is affected, shows up in every generation. But in the case of an affected dad, it will skip a generation. and it's only his daughters, like this one here. Any carrier daughter then would have the potential to produce more affected males in the next generation. So it's a combination of autosomal recessive and a sex-linked pattern. It skips generations, but only in one cross direction. Affected females, not so much, but affected males skipping a generation. And those are the patterns you look for to diagnose an X-linked recessive disorder. Now here's an easy inheritance pattern. Y-linked inheritance. It's not dominant, it's not recessive, just because there's no need to talk about that. The Y chromosome is, again, hemizygous. Only males have it, and only one copy. So there isn't really a concept of dominance or recessiveness on Y-linked traits. And here's the pattern. Males pass it to all of their sons. That's it. Every square that's affected has a Y chromosome. That's why these are squares. They're males because they have a Y chromosome. So if there's a Y chromosome that has a mutation that causes a disease, it passes from father to all of his sons along with the Y chromosome, which is what made them sons in the first place. That's Y-linked inheritance. The final inheritance pattern I want to look at now is cytoplasmic inheritance. And when we talk about the cytoplasm, you might be thinking, well, there's the nucleus in the cell and there's the cytoplasm. And there's no DNA in the cytoplasm, so why are we talking about cytoplasmic inheritance? There is DNA in the cytoplasm, and in animals, that is only mitochondria. The organelles that make our cellular energy in the form of ATP molecules have their own genomes, which sometimes are abbreviated mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria have circular genomes, just like bacteria, and they're inherited in a particular pattern. You may have heard at some point in the past that we inherit our mitochondria entirely from our mothers at fertilization. And there are a couple of potential reasons for that. I won't go into great detail. But one is that at fertilization, there are mitochondria in the sperm, and there are mitochondria in the egg. And it could be, there are two hypotheses. One is that there's dilution of the few mitochondria in the sperm that actually make it into the oocyte at fertilization, so they don't really contribute much in terms of their DNA content to their kids. The other explanation, which is starting to gain some experimental validation, is that the egg actually has proteins in it that specifically target and destroy sperm mitochondria after fertilization. Regardless of the approach, the pattern of cytoplasmic inheritance then is that mothers pass their cytoplasm to all of their children, including their mitochondria. So here we have an affected mother, and she's going to pass that trait on to all of her children because her oocytes were used in fertilization. So she passes whatever mitochondrial genetic disease or cytoplasmic disease, there are other ways to get cytoplasmic inheritance patterns besides the mitochondria, passes it to all of her offspring. What happens at this point in this pedigree? Well, the affected son is marrying a wild type female, and it's the female that passes her cytoplasm to the offspring. So that's it for this pedigree. Mother passes a trait to all of her children, but males never pass the trait on to any of their children. Now at this point, this could look like another type of inheritance pattern. So I'll leave it to you to think about what inheritance pattern this simple two-generation pedigree could represent and what the mom's genotype would be. Is it autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, or X-linked recessive? What are the options just looking at these two generations? We can talk about that in class. So to conclude about inheritance patterns, there are a couple of big take-home messages that you need to consider when you're going to be addressing these sorts of questions. Like, I will show you a pedigree, and I'll ask you to tell me what sort of inheritance pattern it represents. One really important thing to understand is that you arrive at answers by ruling out possible inheritance patterns that certainly couldn't be the case. So for example, if you take a look at this pedigree, there are some possibilities that we could rule out immediately. For example, this is not going to be an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern, most likely, but there's still a possibility. For example, if this male were a carrier and a female were affected, could 4 of their offspring reasonably all be affected by this trait? It's possible, but it's unlikely, so we couldn't rule out the possibility that that's an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. But maybe there are some inheritance patterns we could rule out for that pedigree. So that's point 1. We arrive at answers by ruling out from all of the possible inheritance patterns, autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, cytoplasmic, and Y-linked, there are going to be data that tell us that certainly can't be that. For example, this is certainly not Y-linked. So that's one important point. A related point is that there is not, and this is specifically true for pedigree analysis, I've been mentioning this a lot in class, there is not always going to be one correct answer. There will be pedigrees that give you ambiguous possibilities, that you'll have 3 or 4 inheritance patterns that could all potentially work. So this is not going to be a case where you should expect to arrive at one answer. And again, last, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you PDFs of all of the pedigrees we've looked at here, and a best practice then to convince yourself of how these pedigrees work and how the inheritance of mutations moves from generation to generation is to draw in little sketches of an autosome pair or an X chromosome and a Y chromosome and an X chromosome and an X chromosome for every individual and track the mutations as they move through the generations. And come to me if you have any questions about how this process works.